Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. This is the seventh session of our Mishnah in-depth Masechet Ketubot class with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. This course is a project of Drisha's Rivka Rosenbein Zichron Livracha's Mishnah division and is sponsored in memory of Rivka Rosenbein. As you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to become a panelist. You should accept that invitation. It just means that you come into the main room with all of us. You can choose to turn on your camera if you wish, so we can see your lovely smiling faces. And when Rabbanit Sana invites questions and comments, you would be able to unmute to ask them yourself. We just ask that you keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, so it minimizes the background noise and we can all hear each other. Your questions and comments are always welcome in the chat or in the Facebook comments if you're joining us on Facebook Live. Rabbanit Sana will be screen sharing, so I will read the questions out on your behalf. And with that, I will pass it over to our wonderful teacher.
Hi everyone. So we're picking up back this week after Rabbi Silver's last week. And very, very glad to be back. So thank you all for your forbearance, but hopefully it was a treat last week and gave you a taste of what is to come in the next Masechet with Rabbi Silver. So hopefully that was also exciting. And okay, so tonight we are talking about Ketubot chapters 10 and 11, and then next week we will do the end of Masechet Ketubot. Whoa. It's been a wild ride, with a very kind of challenging Masechet. We are now knee deep into inheritance laws. Which in a way is kind of like what the whole Masachet is about, because the ideal way for a person to collect her ketubah is for her to kind of stay married to someone for a very long time, and then sort of whatever, after 60 beautiful years of marriage, outlive her spouse. And so today we're going to be talking about the status of the widow in halacha. It comes up in the prakim that we learned this past week, and will kind of continue to play a heavy role in the rest of the masachet. So I think it just makes sense to really get a handle on like what the Torah and the Mishnah and halacha see as her role, her rights, her status, because we often have this sense or this like intuition, even from just Western culture in general, that in a way the widow is like the most free of all women, like she's not some like, oh, no one wanted to marry, I'm saying a lot of things I don't believe in, like, oh, no one wanted to marry her kind of thing. She's not a witch, she's not an anything, like she's this amazing woman who lived this amazing life with an amazing husband, and now she's outlived him. And in a way also, right, like, oh, is she maybe she's not even supposed to get remarried. There's actually some, so that the high priest is not allowed to marry a widow, but the Gemara has all these stories about whether rabbis should marry widows, whether they should not marry widows, what that will be like. And there certainly were people who married widows, and widows certainly go on to have second marriages and beautiful lives with new spouses. And you can have this dignified status, at least we imagine that you can have this dignified status as a widow as well. So, but what are like the details of that role? What are the details of that status? So let's take a look, because it'll jump off from some of the mishnayot that we have just learned, and we'll sort of see that this woman has options and how those options play out. So this source sheet is also in the chat. It was also sent out in advance, but you're welcome to follow along with me here too. And then so it's a little bit difficult to see if someone's like raising their hand or something like that, or someone puts a question into the chat while I'm talking and sharing my screen. So if you put a question into the chat, Lily Nath is gonna do the hard work of interrupting me and saying your question. And if you want to say it yourself, I really welcome that. Feel free to just interrupt. And I'll just say to you, oh, I need a minute, like let me finish this idea and then we'll come back to you or something like that. So just be prepared if that's going to happen. Okay, so I know we're
I'd
calling
like
this
to ask you a question.
from the beginning. Yeah, go ahead. Hi, Gershon.
Would you say that every widow is a potential katlanit?
I'm not ready to say that. Like, I think the idea that like if you were married like to someone for like 60 years and he died at 120, then you got married when he was 60, all right, whatever. That like that doesn't make you a katlanit, you know? It's like this, so just for everyone who's following along, a katlanit is a woman whose husbands keep dying on her. And so the Gemara has the status of a like, oh, your third husband dies on you, you're a katlanit. So in a sense, right, like any almanah potentially I guess like is in the world of people who are in the running for that status, but I don't think they really intend an almanah at old age. But what you're getting to, which is something that we're going to talk about in a second, is that actually the almanah really depends at what age what age does someone become widowed, what's the relationship like with the inheritors of her husband, and what are the safeguards from that relationship or not that are gonna kind of determine her quality of life. So that's exactly sort of where we're headed. That I think on the one hand we sort of have this sense of like, oh, the widow, like like maybe she's like the freest woman of them all, but I think actually her circumstances really change everything. Okay. So we have at the beginning of chapter 11, Almana nizonet minichsei yetomim, ma'aseh yadeh shalahem, ve'ein chayavim bikvurata. So a widow is sustained from the property of orphans. It's not like any orphans, the way the English makes it sound. It's like when her husband dies, their children become yetomim, they become orphans. Jewish law recognizes people as orphans if their father died or if their mother died, but more likely of all if their father died. And so when a man dies, all of his property gets passed on to his inheritors. But this is what we're going to learn in a second. Out of that property that got passed on to the inheritors, she gets mizonot, and mizonot also include, we'll see in the next chapter, mizonot is a wider category than just food to eat. So she collects, she is sustained. I like that translation. She is sustained by the property that is in some technical sense of her husband's children. And we don't say her children because actually if there were multiple wives, then there's multiple widows, and if she's not the mother of the children, it doesn't matter. She is still his widow, and she's still sustained out of the property that used to belong to him, which is important. Like we always have to remember that the Mishnah is at least open to a polygynous society, and that makes all the like family dynamics and relationships like one step more complicated than maybe they would be in our kind of monogamous brains. Okay, so she gets sustained out of this property that has gotten passed on to the next generation. So what effectively is sort of the vision I think you're supposed to have based on this Mishnah is that like, okay, a woman is married to a man. During their marriage, he owes her she'er, ksut, and ona, so he owes her sustenance, let's say, clothing, and sex. So now he's dead, he no longer owes her sex, but his estate still has to pay for her sustenance. And that I think is kind of interesting. There's a way in which like the mayor, as long as she has not yet collected her ketubot, which we're going to see we're going to see it in a moment, or we're going to see later on, until she collects her ketubah, she is just fed out of the estate. And we'll see in a second, like at what point, not in a second, we're gonna look at some Torah sources first, but we'll see in a different Mishnah soon, like at what, and then the Gemara about it, like at what point does she kind of have to collect her ketubah? But in our Mishnah, Ketubot 11:1, you kind of have the sense that really, like, her husband died, so now she's married to his inheritors, more or less, and they carry forward her husband's obligations towards her, which is sort of interesting, but like it's not 100% that way. So she eats out of any of the orphans of her husband, and in exchange, they get all of her earnings, but they are not obligated in her burial. Who's obligated in her burial are her inheritors. So she actually has inheritors that might be different than her husband's inheritors, meaning her husband might have had multiple wives, and they might have all had multiple children. Let's say there's 3 wives and each had 2 kids, so there's 6 children. We're talking about one woman, one of the wife A, let's say, out of 3, wife A is being fed out of the estates of all 6 children. Sons, really, most likely, all 6 sons. But at a certain point, she got, she'll reach 120, she will die. The amount owed to her from her ketubah is going to come out of that estate, and it's going to go only to her children. So not all 6, just children A1 and A2, if you're kind of following the family tree here. So children A1 and A2 are then going to potentially use her ketubah money or whatever to pay for her burial. They are the ones who are obligated eventually in her burial. So this sort of division between the husband's estate is responsible for her sustenance, but once she dies and her ketubah has been collected, at that point there's kind of like a retraction from her reliance on that estate. And we're going to see that dynamic, that she has a relationship with the estate of her husband up until the point in which her ketubah is collected, and that's going to break the relationship with the estate of her husband. So that's what we're going to see going forward. But before we do that, I wanted to start with our Mishnah. And I think before we really get into that, we need to backtrack and look at just some of the Torah's reads about the almanah. So in the Torah, as you very well might be familiar, the almanah, the widow, she's lumped in with the Levi ger yatom. So she's lumped in with Levites who don't own property, strangers who aren't natural members of the community, and fatherless yatomim, and orphans, and then widows also. So all these people who sort of are missing, maybe you could say they're missing sort of either land connections or family connections, and that makes them societally vulnerable. Like people who are kind of societally strong are people who have land and family connections, and if you lose one of those, or you don't have either, maybe if you're the stranger, then you're very vulnerable, and the Torah puts you into a protected class. You're the recipient of maaser on a 7-year cycle, and at a certain point, after the 3rd year's maaser has been paid, so the 3rd year is a maaser ani year. It's a year where you pay in you tithe to the poor on the 3rd year. So when that year has been completed, and who all did you give your tithes to in that year? You gave it to the Levi ger yatom v'almanah, and they all ate v'achlu b'sha'arecha v'savayu, and they all ate their fill in your settlements, and then you make this whole declaration actually. At that point, you say before Hashem your God, "Bi'arti hakodesh min habayit." I have cleared out the consecrated portion from the house, and I have given it. V'gam netativ la'levi v'lager v'latom v'almanah kol mitzvatecha asher tzivitani. I have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, just as you have commanded me. Lo avarti mitzvotacha velo shachachti. I have neither transgressed nor neglected any of your commandments. Like that, this is an incredible statement, and we're commanded to be able, with like a straight face, to make this statement with almost like the Levi Ger, the obligations towards Levi Ger Yatom and Almanah as almost like a stand-in for all mitzvot. Lo avarti mitzvotacha v'lo shachachti. I fulfilled all my obligations towards these people, and maybe all my obligations sort of in general. And I was really careful with my Meiser. And then the person who's making this declaration, which is everyone on that year of the cycle, then kind of says to God, based on the fact that I was kind to all of these people and I was careful to tithe appropriately, hashkifa mima'on kodecha min hashamayim, look down from your holy abode from the heavens, u'arichet amecha Israel, and bless your people Israel, and the soil you have given us, kasher nishbata la'avotinu, as you swore to our fathers, eretz zavat chalav udvash, a land flowing with milk and honey. So how do we kind of maintain our relationship to the land and maintain Hashem's blessing onto us? It is through having been kind to this category of people, Levi, Ger Yatom, and Almanah. Okay, so that's like, it's not just, oh, she's a vulnerable person in society. It's actually the whole relationship between God, Israel, and the land of Israel depends on our society taking good care of the almanah and her children, among other categories, but not that many categories, meaning not so many categories such that she gets lost. She is like an example of someone who is vulnerable and who our relationship to Hashem actually depends on us protecting. And we have another example of this in Exodus 22. So we have maybe the source of ona'ah, of the prohibition on oppressing people. So kol almanah v'yatom lo ta'anun. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. And if you do, and if you do mistreat them, some people point out it's interesting that it's oto and not otam. So it's just referring maybe to the orphan, whatever. There's like a lot of reading kind of questions on this. So if you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry when they cry out to me. I will get really angry and I will put you to the sword, and then your wives will be widows and your children will be orphans. So real sense that like God cares about the widow and the orphan. God protects them, and you have to protect them, or else God will make your wives widows and your children's orphans. And that would be sort of like a very serious punishment. Okay, so that's like, I think the Torah's perspective on the widow is sort of really clear. We don't know any of the details about her status or what belongs to her or what doesn't from the Torah. What we do know is that we're extremely sort of intensely commanded to take care of them. And the Rambam in Hilchot Deyot sort of spells this out maybe more extensively. So he, and a little more sort of psychologically. So he says, Chayav Adam lehizaher bitomim va'almanot mivnei shenafshan shvala lemeod v'rucham nemucha. So a person is obligated to really care for orphans and widows because their spirits are very low, their feelings are depressed, This is an interesting thing. It comes up in the Mechilta and in other places. You're not allowed to oppress a widow or an orphan, even if they're super wealthy, which is an amazing insight about what makes someone vulnerable. You might think that, like, oh, people who have money, they're never vulnerable, or they never need support, or they never need love. And there you have the Midrash, and it gets picked up here by the Rambam saying, no, you can be socially vulnerable even if you're crazy wealthy. And you can be depressed even if you're really wealthy, and you can have a low spirit and be sad about your life even if you're wealthy. And that is potentially the category of the widow. And I just think that that's such an important sort of insight, that like wealth doesn't protect people from just like being human. Anyways, okay. So afilu almanato shel melech vitumav muzarim anu aleihem, even the widow of a king and his orphans, we are still commanded about through kol almanavi atom lo tanu. So they're playing on that kol. Every widow and every orphan, even the widow and orphans of a king, right? Okay. And how should one deal with them? So what do you, okay, so we know we're not allowed to oppress them, but like what is like the other side of that? You know, like what are the obligations towards them other than just like not oppressing them? So lo yidaber lehem ela rakut, one should only speak to them gently. Lo yinhog behem ela minhag kavod, and you should only treat them with honor. Don't cause pain to their persons with too much work, or injure their hearts with harsh language. And be more careful with the money of a widow and an orphan than you are with your own money. So that's all the stuff you're supposed to do. And here's what you're not supposed to do specifically. Kol hamaknitan o machisan o ichivlam, anyone who vexes or angers them, hurts their feelings, oppresses them, radabahem o ibeid mamunam, or loses their money, hariza over below tasa, you're violating a negative commandment. V'kol shekan hamakeotam o hamakalan, and how much more so someone who is like hitting them or cursing them. And this negative commandment, if you violate it, you actually don't get lashes for it. But onsho meforash b'Torah, but the punishment for it is made explicit in the Torah, which we saw. Right? God will be angry and he will kill you with a sword. A covenant between he who spoke and created the world, that any time they cry out because they've been wronged, they will be answered, as it says, when they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. I think that there's just, I've been saying it throughout, but this real sense that like God is on the side of the widow and the orphan is a really sort of beautiful idea. Not just that like God will fight your battles for you, not only from the aggression perspective, but also from the perspective of these are people who've lost a link in their family, and you sort of have this image of God saying, I'll be that link in your family for you. Like, I'll be the parent that you lost. I'll be the spouse that you lost. Not in like a weird way, but just in a way of like, there is something, like we often, after we experience loss, we correctly feel like nothing will ever replace the person that left this giant gap in my life. And that's a totally correct way to feel, and a way that makes total sense to feel. And our tradition offers this idea that into that gap could come God. particularly in times of extraordinary distress. So it's not the case, right? God is not going to sleep next to you. God is not going to tuck you in at night. But in cases of extraordinary distress, and especially if that distress is sort of heightened or caused by the gap in family, we do have this offering of God will step in for you, God will protect you, God will avenge you, really is the image we get here, in a way that might be able to provide people comfort in moments when they need it.
It's
but I think,
it's interesting that Rajbam, you're making it, while
the Rambam
seems to think that God is acting out of kindness, Rajbam says that God is going to punish people who don't behave in this way, midah keneged midah.
So you're saying it's justice, not kindness.
That's what Rajbam.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because that seems to be the pshat, which is good because Rashbam is all about the pshat, right? Oh, you're mean to a widow, I'm gonna make your wife a widow. That seems clearly midah keneged midah. So yes, the Rashbam is a great read. I was sitting more in the Rambam, but it's definitely, as always, there are multiple good reads, and that's always valuable. Okay, so let's go back to Ketubot. I don't think we spent any time on this together when we were doing chapter 4. So let's go back now to chapter 4, because here in chapter 4, we're talking about all of these clauses that could or could not be added to a ketubah. So here's one that a person could, let's say a person omitted this from his marriage contract. So let's say there was no clause saying you will sit in my house and be sustained from my property all the days you live as a widow in my house. Nevertheless, says the Mishnah, chayav shehutnai beitin. He's obligated in this because it's actually a stipulation of the beitin. So even if you didn't write it into your ketubah, and by the way, like most of us probably don't have this in our ketubah, it's not in the standard Ashkenazi ketubah today, but it is assumed by all ketubot. And Anshe Yerushalayim and Anshe Galil used to write it explicitly. So Kach hayu Anshe Yerushalayim kovim, Anshe Galil hayu kovim k'Anshe Yerushalayim. But in Yehuda, they had a different practice. Anshe Yehuda yu kovim ad sheyirtzu hayorshim litain lech ketubateich. Lefichach im ratzu hayorshim notnin lech ketubata uvotrinota. So in Yehuda, they had a different practice, which was until the inheritors want to give you your ketubah, you will sit in my house as a widow and be sustained. But once they want to give you the ketubah, your sustenance is over, goodbye. So in Yehuda, what happened is the power is totally in the hands of the inheritors to decide at what point they are cutting off relationship with their father's widow, which, just to be clear, is not necessarily their mother. So yes, it doesn't specify that here, and this does open up the possibility of children saying to their mom, here's your ketubah, we are not supporting you anymore, get out of here, which is a very kind of brutal thing to imagine, though not inconceivable if mom was all kinds of things. Mom was abusive, mom was spending all their money, mom was being really horrible to their wives, I don't know, whatever it is, right? You can totally imagine a world in which children say to their parents, we need financial and other types of separation from you, and the halacha has a carve out for that. On the other hand, the other way to imagine it is actually we're the children of wife A. Wife B doesn't have any children. We're just supporting wife B forever, and then when she dies, we'll give her ketubah to whoever her inheritors are. No, thank you. Wife B, here's your ketubah now, goodbye. And then they're cutting someone out who potentially just like really would have, wanted to be part of their family, and they're saying, you're not our mom, just take your ketubah and go. And so who has the power to sort of like end that relationship? So in Yerushalayim and the Galil, that is on the woman. She gets to decide, when do I take my ketubah and leave, or do I stay here and be sustained from this estate until I die, at which point my inheritors will collect my ketubah. Or it versus in Yehuda, where they would say, it's actually up to the Yorshim, it's up to the inheritors of the estate what type of relationship they maintain with their father's widows. Okay, so then sometimes these debates, this is the second time, by the way, in Masechet Ketubot where we've seen a practical difference between the Galil and Yehuda. And we spent some time on this before that, and we saw also Mishnah Rishona, Mishnah Acharona, and we saw the Safrai family trying to map that onto Yehuda versus the Galil also. So we really are seeing like quite different Ketubot themed practices between these two different communities. And in this instance, they both survive. So just turn it with me to source number 6. So they are quoting the Mishnah, and then they say, Idmar Rav Amar halacha ka'anshe Yehuda, Shmuel Amar halacha ka'anshe Galil. So Rav and Shmuel, who are the first generation of Amoraim in Bavel, each say the halacha is different. And basically what happens is that between them, they're working in different geographies from each other. So Shmuel is the founder of the yeshiva in Neharda, and in Neharda, they all behave the way Shmuel says, where he says halacha ka'anshe Galil. But in like Rav's territory, Bavel, the whole part Vodaha, Bavel and all of its parvarim, all of its like surrounding towns, all behaved like Rav. So you're really seeing these rabbis being like the Mari Da'atra of their places, taking different practices and enacting them in the places that they live in ways that would have really pretty like intensely affected people's lives and families. So much so that we get this little story. So let's look at this for a second. So Hahi bat Mechoza, Zahavat Nesiva Lenaharda. So we have this woman from Mechoza who wanted to marry a man from Neharda. Adu lakame de Rav Nachman. So she's coming before Rav Nachman to talk about her ketubah and to like get that all settled. Shama lekala devat Mechoza, and she is so mechozin that he hears in her voice that she's from Mechoza. And he says to her, oh, you're from Mechoza, didn't you know? Bavel v'chol parvudaha nehagu karav. Didn't you know that Bavel, where Mechoza is, and all of its towns act in accordance with the opinion of Rav? And then the Amruleh, and we don't know really who that is, whether that's the family of the husband, whether that's the husband and the wife together, because Rav's opinion is Ka'anshe Yehuda, which is that it's up to the Yorshim. And so you could imagine here that actually she, even though she's coming from a place that paskins like Rav and paskins like Yehuda, if she's marrying into a Neharda place, she gets a way better deal if you paskin like Shmuel and like the people of the Galil who say it's actually up to her. And so here we see her pushing back, or maybe that, right? This ambiguity. I'm trying to tear apart the ambiguity of Amruleh. So either it's like the couple together, or it's her family saying, we want her to have the privileges of women in Neharda, or I mean, who knows exactly, but they say back, Vahala Neharda Nesiva, she's marrying a Nehardan man. Amar lahu, Ihachi And he said he's convinced. He says, okay, fine. If so, naharda v'chol parvodei nagu k'Shmuel. Okay, fine. So then you should paskin like Shmuel. And then he says, and then the Gemara maybe chimes in, or maybe he's sort of still kind of thinking about it, like, oh, where are the boundaries of naharda or something like that. What are the boundaries of what we would call naharda? Anywhere where the kav measurement of naharda is used. So anywhere that kind of, like, oh, what's the boundary between the United States and Canada when they start measuring things in Celsius, like, or something like that, like measurements really, really can sort of define borderlines. So I did really like that. But I also, like, I'm just very taken by this little story where you're seeing a family pushing to say, well, we really want to be following the rules of naharda here. So you're really, like, it really tips the hand of, like, what's going to be protecting. Also because it's interesting, like, you would have thought, like, I'm marrying into a family, whose minhagim do I follow? Surely, like, in the Gemara's mind, you would follow the husband's minhagim, but actually, Rav Nachman's first thought is like, oh, you're mechoza, I hear it in your voice, like, you're so mechoza. You should follow the halachot of mechoza, and which is in and of itself sort of interesting. And then the anonymous, like, people pushing back, but maybe it's her husband who wants the best for her, maybe it's her parents who want the best for her. Someone, it seems to me, with her best interests in mind, really say, no, we really don't want that. Like, we really want to have the practices of naharda be the majority ones here. And then if we just want to,
we
yeah,
have a comment in the chat, if that's all right.
Yeah, please. Good stuff.
So Rena has shared with us on the topic of orphans, just a news story about how vulnerable orphans are even today, about Russia kidnapping Ukrainian orphans and forcing them to serve in the army. So just wanted to make sure it was acknowledged in the chat.
Wow, Rena, thank you for sharing that. And it's really all over the world. That is totally the case. Right, we should always remember when we're talking about categories of people, that these categories exist, all of the vulnerabilities still, and more, that have always attended to these categories still do today, very much. And I think the other thing, just to say from this story that's so interesting, is you're seeing a family recognizing that vulnerability could come their way in the future, and they're proactively trying to use the ketubah and use this moment of marriage to add in further protections of their own. So I know a few weeks ago we talked about sort of some of the igun kind of prevention work of the international Beitin, but here we'll talk about igun prevention work that's even more widely applicable and important, which is to really take the model of this family and say, what are all the protections that we can build in going into a marriage for every eventuality that might affect this couple. And so today that includes potentially, all sorts of financial prenuptial agreements, and also get refusal prenuptial agreements. So there's some in the United States, there are some good options through the Beit Din of America. There are some other options out there if people are interested. And then in Israel, there's a whole host of options you can find on the Center for Women's Justice, and Sohar, and a few other places are good resources for that. So just, you saying going into a marriage is a time to evaluate my safety, because marriage and all of family building makes you vulnerable, right? It's the same way, like, I'm gonna have a child, that's gonna be really expensive. And what if I die? I need life insurance. Because if I die and can't make money anymore, then my children are really gonna need that $1 million or whatever that I'm gonna get for my life insurance. So just sort of like using this Gemara as a model to say, here's a moment where families are taking care of this woman's safety in a future eventuality that they hope will never happen, right? They hope she'll never be a widow and she'll never be in this vulnerable category, but we all have obligations to ourselves, to our friends, to our families to protect against horrible eventualities, and to do everything we can. So get life insurance. Okay. Never mind. So here's how it plays out lahalacha. So here's the shulchan, because right, what we saw where we left it in the Gemara is like some communities follow Rav, some communities follow Shmuel, and then you have border crossing and how can you get more rights by crossing the border and things like that. So here's where the Shulchan Aruch leaves it. Almana nizunit minichse yorshim kol zman almanutha. A widow is provided sustenance from the property of the inheritors for the whole time of her widowhood. Even if it's not written explicitly in her ketubah, and even if, God forbid, the husband who died, even if his dying wish is my wives should not be fed out of my inheritance, we ignore him. And so we don't listen to him. And the inheritors are not permitted to behave the way that they do in Yehuda. They are not allowed to just pay up her ketubah and ulasalka. He adds in that language that we didn't see in the Mishnah, and to kick her out, to send her away. Right? He adds in kind of the contours that he's seeing of the cruelty in that. And to send her away from her sustenance. Rather, hinizuni al korchan. She gets sustained against their will, against the will of the inheritors, the whole time that she does not try and claim her ketubah, unless they together explicitly stipulated that his wife should not be provided from his property, or shahaya minhag hamakom, or this is like you get sort of the like it goes like Rav and the minhag Yehuda a little bit survives if that's the custom. So the Shulchan Aruch sort of tips his hat at like what he thinks the custom ought to be, but he can't fully say it's prohibited when not only is it in the Mishnah, but you have practical sort of real life stories in the Gemara of people living in places and rabbis judging cases where it's live that this is not the halacha. So he's in a little bit of a bind. He shows you what he thinks, but then he has to say, oh, but the minhag hamakom should be followed. And the Ramah says, oh, by the way, a court can decree so the Beit Din has the power to sort of determine. It's a little difficult to know how to read the Ramah, whether the Beit Din can determine like that in our place the custom is orphans can send out widows, or is it the case, or is it that the Beit Din has the ability to kind of separate orphans and widows, which might be not a terrible thing, as I said before, to imagine cases where a widow might need to be separated from, let's say, her sister wives' children that she might be in certain ways trying to take advantage of or drive crazy or something like that, like retaining a way for the Beit Din to kind of step into harmful situations isn't the worst idea. Okay, so the mishnayot of our parak, just to come back a little bit, contain also a debate about a different sort of element of her rights. So the other special thing about what a almanah is allowed to do is that in order to claim her mizunot, she's allowed to start selling things off her husband's property without the Beit Din being present to make sure it's like a fair sale or anything like that. So here's the Mishnah. Almana bin mina erisin bin mina nesuin mocheret shalo bebeit din. So she gets this special kind of power that she's allowed to sell even when she's not in court. Rabbi Shimon Omer mina nesuin mocheret shalo bebeit din mina erisin lo timkor al bebeit din mipnei she'ein la mizunot v'kol she'ein la mizunot lo timkor al bebeit din. So Rabbi Shimon has this much more limited position, which is she's only allowed to do this type of selling in order to feed herself, in order to collect this like sustaining, sustenance from the husband's estate. And remember, like she's selling the stuff off that would otherwise belong to the other inheritors. So it's actually a really strong power that they're giving her to make these types of sales. Like she is entitled to be sustained by this estate, and she can make it happen on her own, which is just like, that's really strong. And Rabbi Shimon's a little bit anxious about it. So Rabbi Shimon says, okay, no, she's only allowed to do that, not to collect her ketubah, but to collect her mizunot. And a woman who is a widow who never did nisuin, she was just betrothed, but never kind of fully married, she does not collect mizunot, because an arisa doesn't collect mizunot, and therefore she cannot sell without the Beit Din, says Rabbi Shimon. I'm just gonna skip over the Bartanura here, but you have it. So here's the next Mishnah. Machra ktubata o miktata mashkena ktubata o miktata natna ktubata la'acher o miktata lo timkor et hashar ala bebeit din. So this is a continuation. This is understood by all the commentators as a continuation of Rabbi Shimon's opinion, who Rabbi Shimon is quite anxious about this power that we've given to the almanah to sell off her property without the Beit Din, like not in the presence of the Beit Din. So Rabbi Shimon says the minute she starts doing business with any part of her marriage contract, she sells all or part of it, she mortgages all or part of her marriage contract, she gives away some of it as a gift, then anything that's left, says Rabbi Shimon, she has to do in court. Like the minute she has touched her ketubah at all, argues Rabbi Shimon, she has ended her rights to sustenance, because she's now doing business with her ketubah. That means sustenance time is over, argues Rabbi Shimon. And also, once sustenance time is over, everything has to happen in front of the Beit Din. But the Chachamim respond saying, no, mocheret hi afilu arba'a v'chamisha pa'amim, u'mocheret lemizunot shelo b'Beit Din, v'kotevet lemizunot macharti. So the rabbis say, no, actually, she can sell things 4 or 5 times. She doesn't have to do it all at once. And she can, and even once she sold off pieces of her ketubah, she can still go back and sell for sustenance, even not in court. So the arguments between Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon are twofold. One is Rabbi Shimon says the minute she has touched any amount of her ketubah, her time for collecting sustenance is over. Chachamim say, no, she can do some business with some amount of her ketubah and still be collecting sustenance, so long as it's not all of it. And 2 is that even once she has touched her ketubah to a certain degree, the Chachamim say she's still allowed to do business for mizunot outside of the presence of a Beit Din, and Rabbi Shimon says she is not. And they just say she has to keep receipts. Like she just has to keep receipts. Oh, I sold this for mizunot. Okay, and a divorcee who doesn't get sustenance, everyone agrees she sells only in court because she is selling for ketubah and not for sustenance. And also, I think this is where here. Right, so a piece of why this whole thing exists, says the Bartanura, is the reason why a widow is allowed to start to sell off property not in front of a beit din is actually that her husband would have wanted that for her. He wouldn't have wanted her to be embarrassed about going in front of a beit din and saying, I don't have enough to eat, I need to start selling property. That's embarrassing to do that so publicly. Why does the whole world need to know my business? So they give the almanah from Nisuin this special permission. But an almanah from Gerushin, her ex-husband, from a widow from not exactly a widow, right? Like a woman who is just divorced, her ex-husband doesn't care about her embarrassment, and so any laws instituted to just like protect her from being embarrassed in public obviously have been backtracked, and you kind of know that from how embarrassing like Gittin is, and therefore if she's gonna sell property in order to collect her ketubah, she for sure needs to do that in the presence of a beit din. Okay. In the last couple of minutes, I wanted to talk about what happens today, because basically, like, we have a world that's been created where I've shown, actually the widow, she's not off great, like the Torah really puts her up there as one of the most vulnerable members of society. And that seems to be, the way the halacha interprets that, based on the midrash that we saw the Rambam quoting, is like, even an almana of a king, like she is hurting, she has lost a link to family. That is important, and I think that that's, on the one hand, very beautiful, and on the other hand, important to remember that that's a midrash. And I think to a certain degree, the pshat that imagines her being very vulnerable, might really be much more about this image of like the almanah and her yatomim, and this like young mom with little children, mouths to feed. She has all the restrictions in this world of women who can't really own property. Her husband died, left her nothing. Like, I think that's the image that the Torah is meant to conjure in your head. And then the Midrash expands it from there. But the core image is this woman who's left with nothing. And I think the woman who we're talking about in our mishnayot and our Gemaras, I mean, obviously it's like everyone, and we have to keep the Torah's obligations in mind about the vulnerability of this category. And what we're seeing the rabbis do, especially through this idea that she can sell off from the estate without going to beit din, is kind of build protections around this woman who was married to her husband for 60 years, and he died at a ripe old age, and they had a beautiful marriage, and how do we make sure that this woman gets to live out her old age in dignity? And I think that that's sort of another version of the almanah that we see arising from some of the unique rights that she's given. And so particularly the fact that not only is she ideally sustained from his estate for the rest of her life, or until she wants to collect her ketubah, maybe for the purposes of remarrying, for the purposes of moving away, for the purposes of going back to her family, whatever it is, right? But like, she really has options, and one of those options is to stay and be supported by her husband's estate indefinitely. Obviously, that's only good for anything if there's any money coming out of her husband's estate, which is, of course, not so obvious. But that's a quite different vision of an almanah and her status than the Torah is kind of laying out for us in the text about Maser Ani and in the text about Ona'ah, about oppression. So like, not meaning just because someone's vulnerable doesn't mean that they aren't necessarily being oppressed. And it doesn't mean that when we're constructing like rules that are made to be protective, that like, oh, we're not allowed to oppress you, we're not allowed to protect you because the Torah commands us that you're supposed to be vulnerable. Like, no, I don't think that's how it works. This person is de facto vulnerable, or is like necessarily vulnerable, and any amount of halachic protection that we can furnish her with through the assumptions of Ketubot, through the takarat beit din of the family's obligations towards her mizonot, the better it is. And so even though it seems like possibly, Torah Shebechtav does not necessarily have these same rules about the protection for the widow that Torah Shabbat Peh makes explicit, they're definitely, I would say, very much in keeping with Torah Shabbat writing about this person and her vulnerability. And then we see Torah Shabbat Peh coming in to say, yeah, and how are we going to protect this vulnerable person? Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is how this plays out today. Because one of the things that we see almost all the time happening today is that people have secular wills, and usually those wills, let's just say the husband dies first, usually all of his property goes to his wife, and then when she dies, stuff starts to pass on to the next generation. And that's not at all how that works in the halachic system, right? Like we saw from the very beginning, from the first Mishnah in Ketubot chapter 11, all of the property passes on to the Yatomim, and the Yatomim then support the widow or widows, which is not really how we think about it today. So what does it mean to live in a world where we have two separate kind of models of inheritance law? And this is, I brought for you, I linked it here, so everyone should have this link. And I brought for you some writing by Rabbi Willig on this topic. So I just want to read quickly what he says, and you can read it more in depth on your own. But he points out that the monetary laws of the Torah are not super relevant to most people's lives unless you're bringing a din Torah. So if I have a monetary complaint against Leah, let's say, instead of going to secular courts, I'm supposed to take that up with her in a beit din. Fortunately for most of us, we go through our lives without having to do that. So fortunately for many of us, we never have to really engage with the laws of Choshen Mishpat, because like I don't plan on suing Leah anytime too soon. But those laws still apply to us. They just only apply like under duress. They just only apply when a Jew has a monetary claim against another Jew. Like if Lily Nas came and ransacked my home, I might want to sue her in a beit din, but I'm really hoping she's not going to do that. And then the laws of Choshen Mishpat, they still exist. They still apply. But when everything's going right, you don't have to engage. They're not like the laws of Shabbat, where like in an ideal world we're super engaged in those laws, like the laws of Choshen Mishpat are there for bad cases, except that everyone unfortunately dies. And so those laws, the Jewish monetary law, comes into effect for everyone when you die. And so here's Rabbi Willig. Even for the majority who succeed in avoiding disputes and litigations. This is the area of Yerusha. According to the Torah's laws of inheritance, a man's sons are his sole heirs, each getting an equal share, except for the eldest, who gets a double share. And then the halacha provides for the widow, who can exercise one of two options, as we've seen. She can receive food, clothing, shelter from her late husband's estate indefinitely. We're going to talk more about that next week, by the way. And she can lose those rights only if and when she remarries, or she can receive a lump sum payment of the ketubah, which currently would be about $33,000, which is clearly not enough to live on, right? Like, let's say you were married to your husband for 60 years, you're 80, but you could live another 15 years. $33,000 is not going to support your needs for those 15 years, even if you're in tip-top shape, right? So also, like, halacha provides for single daughters, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So the problem is, right, it's a common practice for us to leave a will by which a person's estate is divided according to his own wishes and not in accordance with the halacha. However, a secular will has no halachic validity because it takes effect after death, and after your death, you don't have the power to transfer your possessions according to halacha. Your possessions go where they're going after you die, but it's not directed by your wishes. And the problem then is that, let's say the sons, a person dies and he says, I want to give all my money to Rabbanit Leah. Well, guess what? When he dies, his sons are probably going to be pretty annoyed about that. And if they brought a din Torah at that point, I would have to just basically relinquish my rights. Like, his secular will does not play out in a din Torah, because the secular will is him trying to direct his funds after he dies. So there are a few ways that exist in the world of getting around this. One suggested by Rabbi Joel Roth I was just reading about, who says like actually there's a way to make your will come into effect like the minute before you die, which I think is really great because halacha has this idea of like dying wishes as having tremendous effect and overriding effect over normal inheritance law. And the other way is to do, and we're going to be at time in a second before I fully explain it, but the other way is to do what the Beit Din of America here and the Orthodox Union also recommend, which is to write a halachic will. And the halachic will basically says, I have a let's say you have two sons and a daughter. A person has two sons and a daughter. So it would be to say, my estate owes a huge sum of money to my daughter unless the tenets of my secular will are fulfilled. And so then that like lien on the estate, or that like that chov, that promissory note on the estate can either, so then the sons have an option, right? The option is we'll either pay, let's say the dad had $5 million, had $3 million. So they could either pay $5 million to their sister, or they could accept the standards of the secular will, and then they could pay $1 million to their sister, and each of them also take $1 million, and then Shalom Al Yisrael. So definitely, if you have not heard of a halachic will before, I hope I just did it justice in a very short amount of time, but definitely like click this link, read all about it. It's really interesting and quite important, especially if you think your inheritors are going to not like what you did with your will potentially. Yeah, strong recommend. If you think that there's any chance someone's going to bring a Din Torah about your will, you want one of these. Monique, yeah.
So I don't know if it's appropriate at this time, and you can just show me away if it's not. But I'm actually curious about the process of coming up with a halachic decision. So how would you go about in choosing the order of text? So you start with the Tanakh, right? Start with Torah, and then you go what? Mishnah, Talmud, Shulchan Aruch. I mean, you know what I mean by getting all the different texts to then come up with your own ruling. So it's more a methodological question, which might not have a place here, but
I love those types of questions. I'm very, very interested in them. Usually, like let's say in the case where I'm suing Lily Nas for breaking stuff in my house, okay? So and I bring her to a Din Torah, like I bring her to a Beit Din, on what grounds are they going to be deciding? So the rabbis who are deciding, hopefully Lily Nas did something, really boring, like they've seen a million cases like this where someone, goes into someone's house and like breaks their stuff. So what they're gonna do is they're gonna know the Torah, and they're gonna know the Mishnah, and they're gonna know the Gemara, and they're gonna know also 2,000 years of case law. So they're gonna know, oh, well, there was a case like this, and that seems really similar, and we can read about it in this, book of laws, and we can read about it in this responsa literature. And our teachers, when they saw a case like this, they did it this way, and so that's how we're going to do it. So it's a living Torah, but it's one that's connected all the way through
right.
a long and complicated tradition.
Right, I know, and that's why I mean, in a specific case, I mean, if I wanted, well, not yet, but so I would go first Torah, okay, then the Mishnah, then Gemara, then something else, like because I don't know if everybody would know all of this tradition, with all of the details now. And now there are many other resources that didn't exist before, so you didn't have to have everything in your brain, like Ovadia Yosef, right? Like now there are things, there's Sefaria. You can click on a bunch of stuff and go opening and getting.
Yeah, but you got to know what you're reading on Sefaria, because
right, of
not
course.
all books are created equal, which is
No, sure, and that's why I'm asking, because
yeah, well, it takes years of study and expertise. That's the point. Yeah, keep learning. All right, I think we should probably close up. Next week will be our last Ketubot shiur, and we will be continuing some of this like inheritance stuff through to the end.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna, and thank you so much, all of our participants, for your amazing comments and questions. Before we go, I just want to remind you that we have many more classes happening here at Drisha. You can find all of them and register for them at 5784.drisha.org/spring, including the new session of Mishnah in depth. Next week is our last week with Rabbanit Sarna studying Ketubot, and after that we will be continuing with Nedarim with Rabbi Silber, but we will be learning on Sunday afternoons at 1 p.m. starting on February the 25th. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again next week for our last session of Ketubot. Thank you.